So, this is a story about King Vlad. King Vlad lived in one of these little countries somewhere over that way. And he was not a very good king. In fact, he was a very unpleasant king. He spent his life collecting vast wealth and vast riches. He wanted complete power. It didn't matter if people didn't like the things he did, he just told them that they were wrong and that if he was right. And that if they disagreed with him, that he would throw them into prison or worse. He took the youngest and prettiest girls and made them his concubines, or made them work in his kitchens, or made them his servants in the castle. He took the youngest men who were strongest and sent them off to work in his mines to dig gold and silver to adorn his palace and to give him his personal jewellery, or worse still, to send him off to fight in his army so that he could get ever more lands from the nearby places. Now, he would leave the castle on regular occasions in his grand carriages or riding on his fine horses, and he would parade through the streets, often on the way to the cathedral or somewhere like that, but not for religious purposes, only so that he could show off his finery to the populace. And he would expect them to bow and to scrape before him and to show great obedience. And if anybody dared to show any protest, he would have his soldiers whip them or throw them into prison or worse. Now, one particular Easter, he set off as usual with a grand procession. He expected the whole of the population to be out on the streets and to enter the church after him, or the great cathedral. And as he went, he sort of waved to them, expected them to wave back, but people merely bowed their heads and looked rather cowed down. But he didn't mind. That's how the population should be. That way he could be rich. Well, when he got to the cathedral, he met his brother, who met him occasionally at these events, and they went in together. And Vlad sat on the throne he had had constructed and put into the cathedral just for his visits, and a slightly plainer chair for his brother next to him. Well, things went all right, and he thought about it as he looked around the grandeur. He thought that was a fitting place for him as this wonderful king, with the stained glass windows and so on, and choirs singing. But then he realised that they were singing something called the Magnificat. And when it got to the bit where Mary is singing, "The rich shall be brought down, the mighty shall be brought down, and the poor raised up," he got really rather upset. In fact, he got so upset that he jumped out of his throne and started shouting at people. "Stop this singing at once! Stop this singing at once! This is disgusting! I will not have songs about the mighty being brought down and the lowly being lifted up, because that's subversive and it's against everything I believe in." Well, people didn't take any notice of him shouting and screaming. Really, the soldiers were too busy listening to the choir. The choir carried on, and he got so angry that his face grew red. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. He started going red, and he was almost jumping up and down like a screaming toddler, when suddenly he passed out. It was a long time later that he appeared to wake up. The church, the cathedral, was dark and cold. He looked around. There was anybody there? He called, but there was no reply, just the echo of his own voice in the huge roof of the building. He shivered and felt cold, and from the slight light of the moonlight that came in, he could see All his finery had gone. He was just left in his vest and pants, just standing there in his underwear. How dare they strip me of my clothes? And then he went up to the door and banged upon it. Let me out! Let me out! The voice of the watchkeeper on the other side just said, Oh, my son, you only have to open the door. It's never locked. Let me out! Let me out! King Vlad was not used to opening doors for himself. That's what other people did for him. Well, the old man opened the door and said, What can I do for you, my son? You must have got locked in the church or fallen asleep. And look, you're not dressed very well. Somebody's stolen my clothes. I am King Vlad. I am King Vlad. Well, if you're King Vlad, I'd better take you to the palace, said the watchkeeper, looking rather bemused. We might have some fun here, he thought. So he took King Vlad, still complaining and yelling, and cold and hobbling as he hopped across the cobbles in his bare feet, to the palace, where he was met by the soldiers at the gate. Well, he does look a little bit like King Vlad, but King Vlad's in his throne room, on his throne. But I'm King Vlad! I am King... Well, the soldiers laughed between them, which made King Vlad even more angry. And they said, We're going to have some fun here. Let's take him before King Vlad and see what happens. So they took him before the real king. The real king? The one they thought was the real king. And King Vlad indeed was sitting in his throne room, just sitting at a desk quietly. What can I do for you? Said that King Vlad. We've got a fella here and he's dressed in his underwear, complaining and shouting that he's King Vlad and he needs to see you, and that you're an imposter. Oh, really? He said. Well, show him in. So they brought in King Vlad, screaming and shouting and yelling. And eventually, the King Vlad sat at his desk, put a hand up. Stop, he said. I won't have this chap punished. Give him some food, put him to work in the kitchens, and bring him back to me tomorrow. And each day after that, until he feels like saying sorry for insulting me. They took him away, down to the kitchens, where they indeed fed him, and he reluctantly ate. Now each day was brought before King Vlad, the person sitting upstairs, and each day he noticed that his finery was being sold off. There were less pictures, there was less gold gilt around the place. Some of the servants had disappeared. In fact, there were very few around, just enough to actually be able to run the palace properly. He noticed that the great long table in the great hall each day was filled with the poor who had been brought in from the streets. He noticed that people actually seemed to like this King Vlad, that if he went out they waved to him, that they came to see him, that if he went through the hall, then everybody, instead of bowing, would smile and talk to him. And still he was angry and frustrated, and still he was taken back to the kitchens to work. Eventually, however, he began to realize that the kingdom was a much happier and healthier place, and that he had not really been a very good king. And so one day when he came before the king in the throne room, but without the king sitting on the throne, he merely sat on a wooden chair at a desk. He knelt down before him and said, King Vlad, I know now that you are the true king, and that I have not done the right things. and that I have been selfish, and I will happily work in your kitchens, he said. And as he looked up at the King Vlad sitting there looking down at him, the face changed from that of Vlad to the face of Christ, and his crown turned to a crown of thorns. And he merely smiled at him, said, "My son, you are forgiven." And with that, Vlad awoke. He awoke on the floor of the cathedral with the choir still singing that mighty, mighty song, the Magnificat. And Vlad looked around, and he was still dressed in his finery, his brother looking down at him with a slightly disapproving eye. And from that moment, things changed. And Vlad was a much nicer and better king, and his population loved him and adored him eventually.